Behind the Iron Curtain, beyond the reach of Allied reconnaissance, millions suffered in a network of forced labor camps that stretched across 11 time zones. While the world focused on Nazi concentration camps, another system of brutality operated in parallel, claiming lives on a scale almost impossible to comprehend. These were the Soviet Gulags, and during World War II, they reached their most lethal phase. Tonight we uncover the forgotten atrocities that history textbooks rarely mention, the stories of prisoners who survived conditions designed to kill, the systematic destruction of entire populations, the forced labor that built Stalin's war machine. This isn't a story about heroic battles or strategic victories. This is about the millions who disappeared into the Siberian wilderness, the Arctic tundra, and the Central Asian deserts, about camps where the death rate reached 70%, about a system so brutal that Nazi officials studied it for inspiration, about atrocities that continued long after the war ended, hidden behind Soviet propaganda and Western ignorance. The numbers are staggering. Conservative estimates suggest 18 million people passed through the Gulag system between 1930 and 1953. At least 1.5 million died. Some historians believe the true death toll exceeded 4 million. During World War II alone, over 2 million prisoners died in the camps, more than all American casualties in all wars combined. Yet, these deaths remain largely forgotten, overshadowed by the Holocaust, minimized by Soviet propaganda, ignored by Western allies who needed Stalin to defeat Hitler. The Gulag system predated World War II, but the war transformed it into an industrial death machine. When Germany invaded in June 1941, Stalin's regime made a calculated decision. Prisoners would serve the war effort. They would mine coal, cut timber, build roads, extract minerals, and manufacture weapons, all while receiving starvation rations, all while working in conditions that guaranteed death for the weakest. The NKVD, Stalin's secret police, oversaw the Gulag system. They had absolute authority. They could extend sentences arbitrarily. They could execute prisoners without trial. They could work people to death and simply report them as casualties of war. Who were these prisoners? Political enemies, real or imagined. Ethnic minorities deemed unreliable. Captured Soviet soldiers suspected of cowardice or collaboration. Entire populations deported from their homelands. Common criminals used to terrorize political prisoners. Foreign prisoners of war. Intellectuals, artists, engineers, farmers, anyone who drew the NKVD's attention. The camps were scattered across the Soviet Union's most inhospitable regions. Kolyma, in the Far East, where winter temperatures dropped to -60 degrees Fahrenheit. Vorkuta, in the Arctic Circle, where prisoners mined coal in permanent darkness during winter months. Karaganda, in Kazakhstan, where summer heat exceeded 100 degrees and water was scarce. Norilsk, north of the Arctic Circle, where prisoners built an entire industrial city in permafrost. These weren't rehabilitation centers. They were extermination camps disguised as labor facilities. Let's begin with Kolyma, often called the coldest place on Earth with permanent human habitation. The Kolyma region in Russia's Far East contained dozens of camps focused on gold mining, gold that would help finance Stalin's war effort. Prisoners called it the Land of White Death. The journey to Kolyma was itself a death sentence for many. Prisoners were transported by ship from Vladivostok to Magadan, the gateway to Kolyma. These voyages took weeks. Prisoners were crammed into holds designed for cargo, not humans. Thousands per ship. No sanitation, minimal food, no medical care. People died of disease, suffocation, and despair before ever reaching the camps. Those who survived the voyage faced a 1,000-mile journey inland to the mining camps. In winter, This meant traveling by truck convoy across frozen rivers and mountain passes. In summer, when the permafrost thawed, the roads became impassable mud. Prisoners marched on foot. Those who couldn't keep pace were shot. At the camps, prisoners worked in the gold mines, underground tunnels dug into permafrost, surface mining in temperatures that froze exposed skin in minutes, 12-hour shifts, minimal clothing, inadequate tools, production quotas that were impossible to meet. Failure to meet quotas meant reduced rations. Reduced rations meant weakness. Weakness meant death. It was a system designed to extract maximum labor before disposing of the laborer. Varlam Shalomov, a Russian writer who survived 17 years in Kolyma, documented the horrors. He described prisoners so weakened by starvation they couldn't stand, frostbite so severe that fingers and toes fell off, men driven insane by the combination of cold, hunger, and brutality, guards who would bet on which prisoner would die first.
Medical care was virtually non-existent. Camp doctors were often prisoners themselves, lacking supplies and authority. Scurvy was endemic due to the absence of fresh vegetables. Pellagra from protein deficiency. Tuberculosis spread rapidly in overcrowded barracks. Dysentery killed thousands. Typhus epidemics swept through camps, killing indiscriminately. The camps made no effort to treat sick prisoners. They were simply left to die. Shalomov wrote about the systematic dehumanization. Prisoners lost their names, becoming numbers. They lost their dignity, forced to steal from corpses to survive. They lost their humanity, becoming what prisoners called goners, living corpses who had given up, who would be dead within days. The guards were brutal, but not uniquely evil. They were products of a system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. Many were young men from peasant backgrounds, barely literate, who'd been taught that prisoners were enemies of the state, deserving no mercy. Some guards were sadistic, others merely indifferent. The result was the same: death. Winter in Kolyma lasted 9 months. Temperatures regularly dropped below -40°F. Prisoners worked outdoors regardless of temperature. The only exception was when temperatures dropped below -50°. Then work stopped, not out of mercy, but because tools became too brittle to use. Prisoners lived in barracks that offered minimal protection from the cold. Wooden structures with gaps in the walls, inadequate heating, sleeping platforms packed with bodies for warmth. Lice infested everything. The struggle was simply to survive until morning. Food rations were calculated to keep prisoners alive just long enough to work. The standard ration was about 400 grams of bread per day, made partly from sawdust. Thin soup called balanda, containing mostly water with bits of spoiled fish or vegetables. Occasionally, a small portion of grain porridge. That was it. On this diet, prisoners performed heavy manual labor in extreme conditions. The human body cannot sustain itself on such rations. Prisoners lost weight rapidly. After 6 months, the average prisoner had lost 30 to 40% of their body weight. After a year, they were skeletal. Those who survived longest learned to supplement their rations. They ate grass in summer. They trapped and ate rats. They stole food from the dead. They traded possessions for extra bread. Some turned to cannibalism, though this was rare and severely punished. The mortality rate in Kolyma during World War II exceeded 30% annually. In some camps, it reached 70%. Entire transports of prisoners would be dead within a year. The NKVD simply brought in fresh prisoners to replace them. Gold production continued uninterrupted. Now let's examine Vorkuta, another Arctic camp complex in the Komi Republic. Vorkuta was focused on coal mining, coal that fueled Soviet industry and the war effort. The camp was established in the 1930s, but expanded dramatically during the war. At its peak, Vorkuta held over 70,000 prisoners. Like Kolyma, Vorkuta was located far beyond civilization. North of the Arctic Circle, it experienced polar night, months of total darkness in winter. The coal mines were the prisoners' workplace and tomb. Underground mining in permafrost is extraordinarily dangerous. The frozen ground is unstable. Tunnels collapse without warning. Methane gas accumulates, causing explosions. Flooding is constant as ice melts. Safety equipment was non-existent. Support beams were inadequate. Ventilation was poor. Explosions and cave-ins killed prisoners daily. The NKVD didn't investigate accidents. They simply marked prisoners as deceased and brought in replacements. Prisoners worked in teams, meeting collective quotas. If one team member was weak or injured, the others had to work harder. This created brutal internal dynamics. Weak prisoners were sometimes killed by their own team members, who then divided the dead man's rations. The Enterprise Administration encouraged this. It reduced the prisoner population without official executions. Surface conditions in Vorkuta were as deadly as underground. Winter temperatures averaged -30 degrees Fahrenheit, with extremes reaching -50. Blizzards could last for days with wind speeds exceeding 60 miles per hour. Prisoners still worked. They marched to the mines in darkness, worked 12-hour shifts in darkness, and marched back in darkness. Frostbite was so common that amputations were performed routinely. Prisoners with missing fingers, toes, or limbs were still forced to work until they died. The barracks in Vorkuta was slightly better than Kolyma, built partially underground for insulation, but overcrowding negated any benefit. Bunks were stacked 3 high, with prisoners sleeping in shifts. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, disease, and despair. Prisoner testimony from Vorkuta describes a hierarchy of suffering.
At the top were the professional criminals, the urkas. Stalin's regime deliberately placed these violent criminals among political prisoners. The urkas terrorized political prisoners, stealing their food, their clothes, their possessions. They raped weaker prisoners. They killed for entertainment. The guards allowed this. It kept political prisoners weak and disorganized. In the middle were political prisoners who had learned to survive. They formed small groups for mutual protection. They found ways to supplement rations. They avoided the urkas when possible, fought when necessary. They were the ones most likely to survive. At the bottom were the intelligentsia and those who retained their moral principles. Priests who refused to abandon their faith. Intellectuals who tried to maintain their dignity. These prisoners died fastest. The Gulag was designed to break such people. One particularly cruel practice in Vorkuta was the use of prisoner transport as punishment. When a prisoner became too weak to work, rather than release them or provide medical care, they would be transferred to another camp. The journey itself, in unheated freight cars during winter, killed most prisoners before they arrived. The NKVD could then report that the prisoner died in transit, not in their camp. This artificially lowered the mortality statistics for individual camps while ensuring the prisoner died regardless. During World War II, Vorkuta received new categories of prisoners: captured German and Romanian soldiers, Poles from territories the Soviets occupied, Baltic peoples from Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. These foreign prisoners often died even faster than Soviet citizens. They spoke no Russian. They didn't understand the camp rules. They had no network for survival. German prisoners were particularly targeted. Soviet propaganda portrayed all Germans as fascist monsters, deserving any suffering. Guards and other prisoners alike brutalized German captives. Few survived. The Karaganda camp complex in Kazakhstan represented a different type of Gulag horror. Rather than Arctic cold, Karaganda prisoners faced desert heat and water scarcity. The camps were built around coal mines and construction projects in the Kazakh steppe. Summer temperatures exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no shade. Water was rationed. Prisoners performed heavy manual labor in this heat, wearing the same inadequate clothing they wore in winter. Dehydration killed thousands. Karaganda also served as a dumping ground for deported ethnic groups. The Volga Germans, ethnic Germans who had lived in Russia for centuries, were deported en masse to Kazakhstan in 1941. They were declared potential traitors simply because of their ethnicity. Hundreds of thousands were forcibly relocated to special settlements in Kazakhstan. Many were assigned to labor camps. The mortality rate among Volga German deportees exceeded 40%. Entire families died, children, elderly, women. Stalin's regime made no distinction. The Chechens and English peoples of the North Caucasus were deported to Kazakhstan in 1944. Stalin accused them of collaboration with Nazi Germany. Whether true or not, the punishment was collective. The entire populations of Chechnya and Ingushetia were loaded onto freight trains and sent to Central Asia. The deportation itself killed an estimated quarter of the population. Those who survived ended up in Gulag camps or special settlements where they had no rights and minimal resources. The Crimean Tatars suffered the same fate. Deported in May 1944, loaded onto trains without warning, families separated, elderly and children thrown together in freight cars. The journey took weeks. No food provided, no sanitation. People died by the thousands. Survivors arrived in Kazakhstan and were dispersed to Gulag camps and settlements. Nearly half the Crimean Tatar population died within the first year of deportation. These deportations were acts of ethnic cleansing, disguised as wartime security measures. Stalin used the war as justification to eliminate entire ethnic groups he deemed unreliable. The gulags were the instrument of this genocide. Let's examine the daily reality of life in a typical Gulag camp during World War II. The day began before dawn. Prisoners were awakened by guards banging on metal. They had minutes to use the latrine, a pit with a plank across it, shared by hundreds. There was no toilet paper, no privacy, no dignity. Breakfast was a ladle of thin gruel and a piece of bread. This was your first meal since the previous evening. 16 hours ago. It had to fuel a 12-hour workday of manual labor. After breakfast, prisoners lined up for roll call. This could take hours, especially in winter. Guards counted and recounted. Any discrepancy meant everyone waited while the count was redone. Prisoners stood in sub-zero temperatures, forbidden to move. Many collapsed. Some froze to death during roll call. Finally, prisoners marched to their work assignments: mines, logging camps, construction sites, factories. The march could be several miles. Guards surrounded the column, ready to shoot anyone who lagged behind.
At the work site, prisoners received their daily quota. This was the amount of work they had to complete to receive full rations. The quotas were deliberately set higher than most prisoners could achieve. This ensured a constant food shortage that weakened prisoners over time. Failure to meet quota meant reduced rations. Repeated failure could mean punishment, extended work hours, solitary confinement in a punishment cell, beating, or simply being marked for elimination. Work continued for 12 hours with one brief break for a meal. This midday meal was usually the same thin soup as breakfast, perhaps with a few vegetables if you were lucky. Then back to work until evening. The march back to camp was more difficult than the morning march. Prisoners were exhausted, weakened by the day's labor and inadequate nutrition. Those who couldn't keep pace were beaten or shot. At camp, there was evening roll call. Another hour or more standing in formation while guards counted. Then the evening meal. This was typically the largest meal of the day, relatively speaking. A slightly thicker soup, perhaps a small amount of grain porridge, and the remainder of your daily bread ration if you hadn't eaten it all in the morning. After eating, prisoners had a brief period of free time, but there was no rest. Clothes needed mending, boots needed repair, lice had to be picked from seams. Prisoners who were skilled tradesmen might work on side projects, creating items they could trade for extra food. Lights out came early. Prisoners packed into barracks, sleeping on wooden bunks with minimal bedding. The temperature inside the barracks depended on the outside temperature and the quality of the stove. In winter, prisoners slept fully clothed, huddled together for warmth. The smell was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, diseased lungs, open wounds, human waste. But prisoners were so exhausted, they slept anyway. This routine repeated daily. No weekends, no holidays. Only weather extreme enough to make work physically impossible provided respite, and even then, prisoners were confined to barracks where cold and boredom were their own torments. This was the existence of millions during World War II. Now let's discuss specific atrocities that occurred within the Gulag system during the war. The practice of decimation. This Roman military punishment was revived by the NKVD. When prisoners in a camp engaged in resistance, work slowdowns, sabotage, escape attempts, the NKVD would select prisoners for execution. Sometimes they killed every 10th prisoner, sometimes random selections, sometimes they killed entire barracks. The purpose was terror, to demonstrate that resistance was futile, to make prisoners complicit in each other's deaths, to create an atmosphere where prisoners police themselves out of fear. The punishment cells, or burr. These were cells designed for sensory deprivation and physical torture. Concrete boxes, barely large enough to stand, no heat in winter, no ventilation in summer. Prisoners were stripped naked and thrown into these cells for days or weeks. Many died from exposure. Those who survived were permanently damaged. The conveyor interrogation method. Prisoners suspected of anti-Soviet activities were interrogated in shifts. Teams of interrogators worked in rotation, questioning the prisoner continuously for days. No sleep, no rest, just constant questioning, threats, and occasional beatings. The goal was to extract confessions. The confessions were always false. It didn't matter. The NKVD needed to meet quotas for uncovering conspiracies. Prisoners would eventually confess to anything to make the torture stop. These false confessions were then used to implicate other prisoners, creating an endless cycle of arrests and executions. Medical experiments. Soviet doctors in the Gulag conducted experiments on prisoners without consent, testing new surgical techniques, observing the effects of starvation on the human body, studying frostbite and hypothermia. These weren't scientific studies intended to benefit humanity. They were observations of suffering, treated as data. The sexual violence in the Gulag was pervasive but rarely discussed. Female prisoners were systematically raped by guards, camp administrators, and criminal prisoners. Pregnancy offered no protection. Women gave birth in the camps, and their infants usually died within months from malnutrition and disease. Some women formed relationships with guards or administrators as a survival strategy. These relationships offered minimal protection and slightly better conditions, but they came at enormous cost to dignity and autonomy. Children in the Gulag were perhaps the most tragic victims. Some were born in the camps. Others were arrested with their parents or deported during ethnic cleansing operations. Children received smaller rations than adults. They performed lighter labor but were still worked to exhaustion. The mortality rate among children in the Gulag exceeded 50%. Those who survived were often permanently stunted, physically and mentally damaged by malnutrition and trauma. There were orphanages attached to some camps for children whose parents had died.
These orphanages were barely better than the camps themselves. Children received minimal food and education. They were raised to be loyal Soviet citizens despite the state murdering their parents. Many were recruited into the NKVD, becoming the next generation of oppressors. The psychological toll of the Gulag was as destructive as the physical suffering. Prisoners witnessed daily horrors. They watched friends die. They saw corpses stacked like cordwood. They lived with the knowledge that they might die at any moment, from disease, accident, execution, or simply from their body giving out. Many prisoners went insane. Some committed suicide, though this was difficult given the lack of privacy and means. Others simply stopped functioning, becoming goners who would mechanically perform tasks until they collapsed and died. Yet amid this horror, some prisoners maintained their humanity. Small acts of kindness between prisoners, sharing a piece of bread, helping a weak prisoner complete their quota, teaching literature or mathematics to younger prisoners. These acts of resistance against dehumanization were themselves forms of heroism. Religious faith sustained many prisoners. Despite the Soviet state's official atheism and persecution of believers, many prisoners secretly practiced their faith. Orthodox Christians, Catholics, Muslims, Jews, Buddhists. They held clandestine services. They prayed in secret. They drew strength from belief that their suffering had meaning. The NKVD punished religious practice severely. Prisoners caught praying could be beaten, placed in punishment cells, or executed. But faith persisted. It was one of the few things the Gulag couldn't completely destroy. Let's examine the economic dimension of the Gulag. Forced labor was central to Stalin's industrialization plans. The Gulag wasn't just punishment, it was an economic system. The main administration of camps, known by its Russian acronym Gulag, was a department within the NKVD. It operated as a vast business enterprise. It managed mines, factories, construction projects, and agricultural operations across the Soviet Union. The labor was essentially free. Prisoners received minimal rations, no wages, no rights. They could be worked to death and easily replaced. This gave the Gulag economic advantages over free labor. During World War II, the Gulag economic importance increased dramatically. The Soviet Union needed resources to fight Germany: coal, oil, timber, metals, food. The Gulag provided all of these through forced labor. Prisoners built the roads and railways that transported supplies to the front. They manufactured weapons and ammunition. They mined the coal that powered factories. They cut the timber that built fortifications. They grew food in prison farms. The Red Army's ability to fight depended partly on Gulag labor. This creates a disturbing moral equation. The Soviet Union was America's ally against Nazi Germany. The United States provided massive aid to the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease program. American trucks, jeeps, aircraft, food, and equipment helped the Red Army defeat Germany. But that same Red Army was supported by a system of forced labor that rivaled Nazi concentration camps in its brutality. Western leaders knew about the Gulag. American and British intelligence had information about the camps, but they chose to ignore it. Defeating Hitler was the priority. Stalin's crimes were overlooked. After the war, this moral compromise became even more problematic. The Nuremberg trials prosecuted Nazi war criminals for crimes against humanity, but no Soviet officials were ever prosecuted for Gulag atrocities. The trials established the principle that following orders is not a defense for committing atrocities, but this principle was only applied to Germans, not Soviets. The hypocrisy was stark and damaged the legitimacy of international law. The exact number of people who died in the Gulag during World War II remains unknown. Soviet records were deliberately falsified. The NKVD had incentives to underreport deaths. Camp administrators who reported high mortality rates could be punished for failing to maintain their workforce. So deaths were hidden. Prisoners who died were reported as transferred. Mass graves were unmarked. Entire transports of prisoners would disappear from records. Modern historians, working with archives opened after the Soviet Union's collapse, have attempted to calculate the true toll. The most reliable estimates suggest that between 2 and 3 million prisoners died in the Gulag between 1941 and 1945. This is comparable to the total number of Soviet soldiers who were prisoners of war in German camps. But while Soviet POWs in German camps are well documented and commemorated, Gulag victims remain largely forgotten. The camps continued after the war. Stalin's paranoia increased. Returning Soviet POWs were arrested for suspected collaboration. Many went directly from German POW camps to Soviet Gulag camps. Veterans who had seen the West were considered security risks. Intellectuals were purged. Ethnic minorities continued to be deported.
The Gulag reached its maximum population in the early 1950s, holding nearly 2.5 million prisoners. It was only after Stalin's death in 1953 that reforms began. Khrushchev's denunciation of Stalin in 1956 led to mass releases. Millions of prisoners were freed. Many camps were closed. The Gulag system was reformed, though it never completely ended. But even after release, Gulag survivors faced persecution. They were forbidden to return to major cities. They had difficulty finding work. They were socially stigmatized. Speaking about Gulag experiences was dangerous even after Stalin's death. The Soviet regime wanted these stories suppressed. It took decades for survivor testimonies to be published. Alexander Solzhenitsyn's The Gulag Archipelago, published in the West in 1973, was the first comprehensive exposure of the system. Solzhenitsyn, himself a Gulag survivor, compiled hundreds of survivor accounts into a devastating indictment of the Soviet system. The book was banned in the Soviet Union, but circulated in Samistat, underground publications. It shocked the world and earned Solzhenitsyn the Nobel Prize in Literature. But the book also generated controversy. Some Western intellectuals dismissed it as anti-Soviet propaganda. Others minimized the Gulag's significance, arguing that American racism or capitalism were equally bad. This moral equivalence was obscene, but reflected Cold War politics. Only with the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991 did the full truth begin to emerge. Russian archives opened, revealing the scale of Stalin's crimes. Mass graves were discovered and excavated. Survivors, now elderly, finally felt safe enough to speak openly about their experiences. Memorial societies were founded to document Gulag history and honor victims. But this openness has been reversed in recent years. The Russian government under Putin has restricted access to archives. Memorial societies have been persecuted. Teaching the full truth about Stalin's crimes has become controversial. There's a push to rehabilitate Stalin's reputation, emphasizing his role in defeating Nazi Germany while minimizing his crimes. This revisionism is dangerous. It allows atrocities to be forgotten. It dishonors victims. It prevents proper reckoning with the past. The Gulag represents one of the 20th century's greatest crimes against humanity. Yet it remains less known than Nazi concentration camps. Why? Several reasons. First, the Holocaust has been extensively documented, studied, and memorialized. Nazi Germany kept meticulous records. Concentration camps were liberated by Western armies who documented what they found. Survivors immigrated to the West and testified. The Holocaust became central to understanding World War II. The Gulag, by contrast, was hidden behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union controlled information. They minimized or denied atrocities. Western access was restricted. Survivors couldn't speak freely. The camps weren't liberated by Western armies, so there were no newsreels showing the horrors to Western audiences. Second, Cold War politics complicated things. The Soviet Union was America's ally during World War II and rival afterward. Acknowledging Soviet atrocities during the war raised uncomfortable questions about American support for Stalin. It was easier to focus on Nazi crimes. Third, ideological factors played a role. Communist ideology had sympathizers in the West who denied or minimized Soviet crimes. Unlike Nazism, which was universally condemned, communism retained defenders who argued that the Gulag was necessary for building socialism or was Western propaganda. Fourth, the sheer scale of Soviet territory made documentation difficult. Gulag camps were scattered across 11 time zones. Many were in remote locations that remain difficult to access even today. Unlike concentration camps in the heart of Europe, these camps couldn't be easily visited or studied. Fifth, there was survivor silence. Many Gulag survivors were too traumatized to speak about their experiences. Others feared retribution. Some felt guilt about what they had done to survive. Unlike Holocaust survivors, who found support networks and were encouraged to testify, Gulag survivors were often isolated. But the Gulag must be remembered, not to diminish the Holocaust or engage in comparative suffering. Both were genocidal systems that murdered millions. Both represent the depths to which totalitarian ideologies can sink. Understanding the Gulag is essential to understanding the 20th century. It reveals how industrialized mass murder wasn't unique to Nazi Germany, how communist ideology could justify crimes as horrific as fascist ideology, how ordinary people can become perpetrators, victims, or bystanders in systems of oppression. The Gulag also reveals the human capacity for survival and resistance. Prisoners who maintained their humanity despite everything, who helped each other, who preserved culture and memory, who survived to bear witness. Their stories deserve to be heard.
Let's return to individual stories to understand the human dimension. Eugenia Ginsburg was a literature professor arrested in 1937 during Stalin's Great Purge. Accused of counter-revolutionary activities based on nothing, she was sentenced to 10 years in the Gulag. She survived Kolyma, one of the deadliest camps. Her memoir, Journey into the Whirlwind, describes the systematic degradation prisoners endured, a constant hunger, the cold, the arbitrary cruelty, but also moments of humanity, a guard who secretly brought extra bread, fellow prisoners who shared their rations, poetry recited from memory to maintain sanity. Ginsburg survived, was released after 18 years, and wrote her memoir. It's one of the most powerful testimonies of Gulag life. Gustav Herling was a Polish soldier arrested by the Soviets in 1940 when they occupied eastern Poland. Accused of espionage, he was sent to a northern camp. His memoir, A World Apart, describes the peculiar horror of being imprisoned by the Soviet Union while Nazi Germany occupied his homeland. He was an enemy of both totalitarian systems simultaneously. Herling documented the camp hierarchy, the brutality of the Irkutsk criminal class, and the moral degradation that prolonged suffering caused. He also described prisoners who resisted that degradation through small acts of defiance. Herling was released in 1942, when Poland and the Soviet Union became allies. He joined the Polish army in exile and fought with the British. After the war, he settled in Italy and spent his life writing about totalitarianism. Julius Margolin was a Jewish philosopher from Poland. When the Soviets occupied eastern Poland, he fled east, thinking he'd be safe from Nazi persecution. Instead, he was arrested as a refugee without proper documents and sentenced to 5 years of forced labor. Margolin spent those 5 years in Arctic camps. As a Jewish intellectual, he was particularly targeted by both guards and criminal prisoners. He survived through a combination of luck and determination. After his release in 1945, Margolin left the Soviet Union and eventually settled in Israel. He wrote a comprehensive memoir, Journey into the Land of the Czechs, which detailed every aspect of Gulag life. The book was ignored in the West for decades because it contradicted the Soviet Union's wartime ally image.
Janusz Bardach was a Polish Jew who fled to Soviet-occupied Poland to escape the Nazis. He was 16 years old. The Soviets arrested him, accused him of espionage, and sentenced him to 10 years in a Gulag camp. Bardach was sent to Kolyma. As a teenager, he was particularly vulnerable to the brutality of older criminal prisoners. He survived by becoming a medical orderly, a position that offered slightly better conditions and some protection. Bardach served his full sentence, was released, became a doctor, and eventually emigrated to the United States. Late in life, he wrote his memoir, Man is Wolf to Man, describing his Gulag years. The title reflects his experience of how the camps brought out the worst in human nature. These individual stories reveal patterns. First, many Gulag prisoners were arrested arbitrarily. They had committed no real crimes. The NKVD had quotas for arrests. They filled those quotas by arresting whoever was convenient. Second, survival often depended on factors beyond individual control. Youth, physical strength, useful skills, and sheer luck determined who lived and who died. Third, prisoners maintained humanity through small acts of solidarity, sharing food, reciting poetry, teaching skills. These acts of resistance against dehumanization were crucial to psychological survival. Fourth, guards and administrators were capable of both cruelty and occasional mercy. Some were sadistic monsters. Others were ordinary people implementing brutal policies. A few showed unexpected kindness. This reminds us that evil systems are operated by human beings, making choices. Fifth, the Gulag left permanent scars. Survivors carried trauma for the rest of their lives. Many suffered from what we now call PTSD. Physical health was often permanently damaged. Families were destroyed. Careers were ruined. The Gulag's impact extended far beyond the years prisoners spent in camps. Let's now examine the aftermath of the Gulag and its legacy. When Stalin died in March 1953, the Gulag held about 2.5 million prisoners. Khrushchev, who became Soviet leader, recognized that the Gulag was economically inefficient and politically destabilizing. In 1956, he delivered his secret speech to the Communist Party denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and some of his crimes. This led to mass releases. By the end of the 1950s, the Gulag population had dropped to about 300,000. Most camps were closed, forced labor was reduced, though not eliminated. But the Soviet government never fully acknowledged the scale of Gulag atrocities. There was no equivalent to the Nuremberg trials for Soviet crimes.
No NKVD officials were prosecuted. Camp commanders faced no consequences. Guards went unpunished. This lack of accountability meant that many perpetrators continued living normal lives. Some remained in government positions. Survivors encountered their former torturers on the street, free and unpunished. This was deeply traumatic. Released prisoners faced severe restrictions. They couldn't return to Moscow, Leningrad, or other major cities. They needed special permits to live in certain areas. They had difficulty finding employment because of their record. They were socially stigmatized. Families often rejected them. Former prisoners were seen as contaminated by their association with the Gulag. Marriages fell apart. Children were ashamed of their parents' past. Despite these obstacles, some survivors rebuilt their lives. They found work in provincial cities. They remarried and started new families. They tried to move forward. But the trauma remained. Nightmares, hypervigilance, difficulty trusting others, physical ailments from years of malnutrition and hard labor. Speaking about Gulag experiences was dangerous even after Stalin's death. The KGB, successor to the NKVD, monitored former prisoners. Those who spoke too openly could be rearrested. So most survivors remained silent. They told their families little or nothing about their experiences. This silence prevented processing trauma and passing historical truth to the next generation. Only in the 1980s, during Gorbachev's glasnost period of openness, did survivors feel safe enough to speak publicly. Memorial societies were founded to document Gulag history. Survivors gave interviews. Archives opened. The Soviet Union officially acknowledged that millions had been unjustly persecuted. Mass graves were discovered. Memorial sites were established. Victims were rehabilitated, their names cleared. But this openness was brief. After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Russia went through a chaotic period of transition. Gulag history wasn't a priority. Many archives remained closed. Funding for memorial work was limited. In the Putin era, there's been a deliberate effort to rehabilitate Stalin's image. State-controlled media emphasizes Stalin's role in defeating Nazi Germany while minimizing or justifying his crimes. School textbooks present a sanitized version of Soviet history. Discussing Stalin's crimes is increasingly controversial. Memorial, Russia's most prominent human rights organization dedicated to documenting Soviet crimes, was forced to close in 2021. The government labeled it a foreign agent and shut it down. This represents a return to suppressing uncomfortable truths about the past. Today, Russia has not fully confronted its Gulag legacy. There's been no truth and reconciliation process, no comprehensive national memorial. Many mass graves remain unmarked. The descendants of perpetrators have never acknowledged their ancestors' crimes. This failure to reckon with the past has consequences. It allows authoritarianism to persist. It prevents healing. It dishonors victims. It enables revisionism. Internationally, the Gulag remains poorly understood. Most people in the West know about Nazi concentration camps, but not Soviet labor camps. This ignorance is dangerous. It allows people to romanticize communism or minimize its crimes. It prevents learning lessons about totalitarianism. Understanding the Gulag requires understanding how it functioned differently from Nazi concentration camps, while being equally deadly. The Nazi camps aimed primarily at extermination, especially for Jews. The Gulag's primary purpose was forced labor, with extermination as a secondary effect. The Nazis industrialized killing using gas chambers for mass murder. The Gulag killed through attrition, overwork, and neglect. Both systems murdered millions. Both dehumanized victims. Both served totalitarian ideologies. Both should be studied, remembered, and condemned. The Gulag's legacy extends beyond Russia. Communist regimes in China, Cambodia, North Korea, Vietnam, and other countries created similar forced labor systems. Mao's Laogai camps in China imprisoned tens of millions. Pol Pot's killing fields in Cambodia murdered 2 million. Kim Il-sung's Kwanliso camps in North Korea continue to operate today. These systems were directly inspired by Stalin's Gulag. The ideology was the same, the methods were similar, the results were genocidal. The 20th century saw totalitarian regimes kill over 100 million people. The Gulag was a major component of that death toll, yet it remains a forgotten atrocity. This must change. History education must include the Gulag. Students learning about World War II should understand that atrocities occurred on both sides of the Eastern Front. They should know that Stalin's regime murdered millions of its own citizens. They should understand that defeating Nazi Germany required alliance with another mass-murdering regime. This creates moral complexity that's uncomfortable but necessary.
The memoirs of Gulag survivors should be as widely read as Holocaust memoirs. Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago should be required reading. Warlam Shalamov's Kolyma tales should be studied. Eugenia Ginsberg's Journey into the Whirlwind should be taught. These testimonies preserve essential truths about human nature, tyranny, suffering, and survival.
Memorial sites should be established and maintained. The mass graves should be excavated and victims properly honored. Museums should document Gulag history. Educational programs should teach new generations about these crimes. The comparison to Holocaust memorialization is instructive. The Holocaust is extensively memorialized through museums, education programs, survivor testimonies, and cultural works. This memorialization serves important purposes. It honors victims. It educates about the dangers of anti-Semitism and totalitarianism. It provides historical understanding. The Gulag deserves similar attention, not to diminish the Holocaust, but to expand our understanding of 20th century atrocities. Both genocides should be remembered. Both have lessons to teach. Why does this matter now? Because authoritarian governments still operate forced labor camps. North Korea's Kwanliso system holds over 100,000 prisoners in conditions rivaling the Gulag. China's re-education camps in Xinjiang hold over 1 million Uyghur Muslims in forced labor and political indoctrination. Eritrea uses forced conscription as a form of labor slavery. These modern atrocities are the Gulag's heirs. Understanding the historical Gulag helps us recognize and resist its contemporary manifestations. It reminds us that such systems don't arise overnight. They develop gradually through incremental erosions of rights and rule of law. The Gulag also teaches about the danger of ideologies that promise utopia. Stalin claimed the Gulag was necessary to build socialism and defend the revolution. The camps were justified as re-education and labor training. Reality was mass murder disguised as social engineering. This pattern repeats. Authoritarian regimes always justify their camps. They're for public safety, they're for re-education, they're for national security. These justifications should be recognized as the lies they are. The Gulag teaches about the importance of documentation. Much of what we know about the camps comes from survivors who risked everything to write their testimonies. Solzhenitsyn smuggled manuscripts out of the Soviet Union. Shalamov wrote in secret for decades. These brave individuals preserved truth against a regime determined to suppress it. Today, in countries with authoritarian governments, brave people continue this work. They document human rights abuses. They smuggle information out. They testify despite risks. Their work is essential. The Gulag teaches about the banality of evil, to use Hannah Arendt's phrase. Camp guards weren't all monsters. Many were ordinary people who committed atrocities because the system rewarded it and normalized it. They dehumanized prisoners and convinced themselves they were doing necessary work. This is how ordinary people become perpetrators. This is how bureaucracies commit genocide. This is why individual moral responsibility matters, even in oppressive systems. The Gulag teaches about human resilience. Prisoners survived unimaginable conditions. They maintained humanity despite systematic dehumanization. They created art, literature, and music in the camps. They formed friendships and helped each other. They resisted in small but significant ways. This resilience doesn't justify the camps, but it reminds us of human capacity for survival and moral courage, even in darkest circumstances. The Gulag also reveals the moral compromises Western democracies made during World War II. The United States and Britain allied with Stalin knowing about his crimes. They provided massive material support to the Soviet war effort. They attended conferences with Stalin and treated him as a legitimate leader. This was arguably necessary to defeat Hitler, but it came at a cost. Millions of people suffered and died in the Gulag while Western powers looked away. This is not to create false equivalence. Democratic societies, with all their flaws, are fundamentally different from totalitarian regimes.
But democracies can be complicit in atrocities when they prioritize expedience over principles. The Cold War division of Europe at Yalta essentially abandoned millions of people to Soviet rule. Eastern European countries became Soviet satellites, where Gulag-style repression continued. The West accepted this because preventing it would have required war with the Soviet Union. Whether this was the right decision is debatable, but it's important to acknowledge that millions paid the price for Western strategic calculations. In the 21st century, we face similar dilemmas. How should democracies respond to regimes that operate forced labor camps? Should we impose sanctions, even if it hurts our own economies? Should we provide aid to authoritarian regimes that commit atrocities if those regimes help with other priorities? These questions have no easy answers, but understanding the Gulag's history reminds us that the cost of looking away is measured in human lives.
We must also consider the Gulag's impact on Russian society. The camps touched virtually every Soviet family. Estimates suggest that 1 in 5 Soviet citizens spent time in a Gulag camp or special settlement at some point. Millions more had family members who were imprisoned. This created a society-wide trauma that persists today. The culture of denunciation that fed the Gulag destroyed social trust. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Colleagues reported each other. Family members denounced relatives to prove loyalty. This poisoned social relationships. The effects lasted generations. The economic consequences were also profound. The Gulag was economically inefficient despite using forced labor. Prisoners were too malnourished and exhausted to be productive. The cost of guarding and transporting prisoners exceeded the value they produced. Resources that could have been used productively were wasted on maintaining a vast prison system. The Soviet Union's economic problems partly stemmed from this misallocation of resources and labor. The intellectual cost was immense. Stalin's purges and the Gulag destroyed a generation of scientists, engineers, artists, and writers. The Soviet Union could have been far more advanced if these talented people had been allowed to work freely rather than being imprisoned or killed. The persistence of authoritarianism in Russia today connects to the Gulag legacy. Russian society never fully processed this trauma. There was no equivalent to Germany's post-war reckoning with Nazism. Soviet crimes were minimized or denied. This failure enables current authoritarianism. It allows leaders to suppress dissent without facing historical accountability. Breaking the cycle requires truth. It requires acknowledging what happened. It requires teaching accurate history. It requires honoring victims. It requires holding perpetrators accountable, even posthumously. This hasn't happened in Russia and seems unlikely under current leadership, but it remains necessary. As we conclude this examination of the Gulag's forgotten atrocities, several truths must be emphasized. The Gulag was one of history's greatest crimes against humanity. Millions died through a combination of deliberate cruelty, systematic neglect, and ideologically driven murder. The camps operated on a scale rivaling Nazi concentration camps, yet remain far less known. This is a failure of historical memory that must be corrected. The Gulag during World War II reached peak lethality. War provided cover for increased brutality. Prisoners were worked to death to support the Soviet war effort. Ethnic minorities were deported and condemned to death in the camps. The mortality rate exceeded anything in peacetime. Individual stories of survivors reveal both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human resilience. The testimonies of people who lived through the Gulag are essential historical documents. They must be preserved, studied, and taught. The failure to prosecute Gulag perpetrators and fully acknowledge Soviet crimes represents a major injustice. This failure enabled continued authoritarianism and prevents healing. It dishonors victims and allows revisionism. Understanding the Gulag is essential for understanding totalitarianism, genocide, and the 20th century. The camps reveal how ideologies that promise utopia can justify any atrocity, how bureaucracies can implement mass murder,
how ordinary people can become perpetrators or heroes, how human beings survive the unsurvivable. The Gulag's legacy continues today. Modern forced labor camps in North Korea, China, and elsewhere are the Gulag's descendants. Understanding the historical Gulag helps us recognize and resist these contemporary atrocities. We must remember, we must teach, we must honor victims, we must hold perpetrators accountable. We must ensure that never again applies to all genocides, not just the Holocaust. The millions who died in the Gulag deserve to be remembered. Their suffering should not be forgotten. Their stories should be told. Their deaths should be mourned, and the system that murdered them should be condemned as absolutely and universally as Nazi concentration camps. This is not about Cold War politics or ideological point scoring. This is about basic human decency and historical truth. The Gulag was evil. The suffering was real. The death toll was massive. These facts should not be controversial. They should be acknowledged, studied, and remembered. The forgotten atrocities of the Soviet Gulag must be forgotten no longer. The world must know what happened, must understand the scope of the horror, must commit to preventing anything similar from happening again, and must honor the memory of the millions who suffered and died in Stalin's camps during World War II and beyond. Their lives mattered. Their suffering was real. Their stories deserve to be heard. And the system that murdered them should be condemned as absolutely and universally as Nazi concentration camps. This is not about Cold War politics or ideological point scoring. This is about basic human decency and historical truth. The Gulag was evil. The suffering was real. The death toll was massive. These facts should not be controversial. They should be acknowledged, studied, and remembered. The forgotten atrocities of the Soviet Gulag must be forgotten no longer. The world must know what happened, must understand the scope of the horror, must commit to preventing anything similar from happening again, and must honor the memory of the millions who suffered and died in Stalin's camps during World War II and beyond. Their lives mattered. Their suffering was real. Their stories deserve to be heard. And the system that murdered them should be condemned as absolutely and universally as Nazi concentration camps. Thank you for bearing witness to this difficult history. Thank you for remembering those the world tried to forget. Thank you for committing to ensuring these atrocities are never repeated. Remember the Gulag. Remember its victims. Remember the truth.